On the night of February 13th, 1945, the skies above Dresden erupted into a vision of hell that no one had ever seen before, and few would ever forget. It was a city of art and music, of porcelain and palaces, a jewel of Saxony that had escaped the worst of the Second World War's destruction. And then, in a single night, it became a furnace. More than 3,900 tons of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries rained down upon the Baroque skyline, igniting a firestorm that would kill tens of thousands and reduce centuries of culture to ash. For decades, historians have debated what happened that night. Was Dresden's annihilation a necessary blow to the Nazi war machine, or was it an act of cold, calculated vengeance? To understand the bombing of Dresden, we must first understand the context. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. The Western Allies had crossed into the Rhine, and Soviet forces were less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. German cities were in ruins. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, and defeat was only a matter of time. But even in its death throes, the Third Reich fought on. Hitler's armies were retreating on all fronts, yet still capable of inflicting heavy casualties. German industry, though battered, continued to churn out weapons. Railways still moved troops and supplies. The Nazi leadership had no intention of surrendering. It was in this climate that Allied air commanders looked to Dresden, a city that, up to that point, had been largely untouched by strategic bombing. Dresden was not just a cultural treasure, it was also a key transportation hub in eastern Germany. Rail lines converged there, carrying reinforcements and materiel to the Eastern Front. Several factories on the city's outskirts produced military goods. Intelligence reports, some exaggerated, claimed that the city was full of troops and refugees, straining its infrastructure. And so, in early February 1945, the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force added Dresden to their target list. The operation was part of a broader strategy known as area bombing, pioneered by Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, known as Bomber Harris. His doctrine was simple: destroy the enemy's cities, break civilian morale, and cripple Germany's ability to wage war. Harris had long argued that bombing could be a war-winning weapon, and Dresden, in his view, was a legitimate target. At the same time, Allied planners were keen to demonstrate their power to the advancing Soviets. A spectacular display of air power against a major city in the path of the Red Army would serve as a message, both to Germany and to Stalin. The attack was meticulously planned. The RAF would strike first, at night, with waves of heavy bombers carrying high-explosive bombs to blow apart roofs and walls, followed by incendiaries to ignite the exposed interiors. Then, as fires raged and emergency services struggled, American bombers would arrive the next day to strike again in daylight. It was a textbook example of the firestorm tactic, perfected over years of bombing Hamburg, Cologne, and other German cities. At 10:03 p.m. on February 13th, the first British bombers reached Dresden. Pathfinders dropped flares to mark the target, and within minutes, the sky was ablaze with explosions. The first wave lasted just 15 minutes, dropping 881 tons of bombs. Then, nearly 3 hours later, a second, larger wave arrived. The timing was deliberate, designed to catch civilians as they emerged from shelters or attempted to fight fires. By dawn, vast sections of the city center were engulfed in flames. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to smoldering rubble. The temperature soared above 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The oxygen was sucked from the air. People were incinerated where they stood or suffocated in basements turned into ovens. On February 14th, the Americans joined the devastation. Waves of B-17 flying fortresses pounded the ruins with another 1,800 tons of bombs. Some targeted railway yards and bridges, but many simply added to the inferno. Even on February 15th, with the city already obliterated, another raid hit what was left. By the time the smoke cleared, Dresden was a wasteland. The Frauenkirche, one of Europe's great churches, lay in ruins. The Zwinger Palace, the Semper Opera House, the museums and galleries that had made Dresden a cultural beacon, all were destroyed or badly damaged. The human toll remains the subject of debate. Nazi propaganda initially claimed 200,000 dead, a grotesque exaggeration meant to fuel outrage. Later estimates put the figure between 25,000 and 35,000. Still one of the deadliest air raids in history. Many victims were refugees from the east, fleeing the Red Army. Others were prisoners of war, forced laborers, or ordinary citizens who had believed that Dresden's cultural importance would protect it from destruction. The scale of the disaster shocked the world, and even some Allied leaders. Winston Churchill, who had authorized the bombing campaign, later distanced himself from the operation, calling it a mere act of terror. In his memoirs, he wrote that the destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. Yet others defended it as a legitimate military action. They pointed out that Dresden's rail network was crippled, its industry disrupted, and its ability to support the Eastern Front severely diminished. They argued that the bombing shortened the war and saved lives in the long run. But was it necessary? By February 1945, Germany was already defeated in all but name. The Soviet Union was weeks away from entering Berlin. Allied forces were racing through the Rhineland. The Reich's cities were already in ruins. Critics argue that Dresden's destruction had little strategic value and that it was motivated less by military necessity than by a desire for retribution. They point to the timing, just weeks before Germany's surrender, and to the deliberate targeting of the city center, far from the main industrial zones. To them, Dresden was not a military target, but a symbol, a message written in fire and ash. The ethical debate over Dresden continues to this day. It raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of modern warfare, about the thin line between victory and vengeance. Can the deliberate destruction of a city and the mass killing of its inhabitants ever be justified, even in a just war? Was Dresden a tragic but necessary blow against a murderous regime? Or was it, as some have called it, a war crime committed by the victors? In the decades since 1945, Dresden has become more than a historical event. It has become a symbol of the devastating power of modern warfare, a symbol of the suffering of civilians caught between great powers, and for some, a symbol of Allied hypocrisy, a reminder that even those who fought tyranny are capable of terrible acts themselves. Yet to fully understand Dresden's legacy, we must go beyond the flames and rubble and explore the deeper motives, myths, and meanings that still surround it. One of the most persistent myths is that Dresden was a purely cultural city with no military significance. While it is true that Dresden was renowned for its art, architecture, and intellectual life, it was also an important industrial and logistical center. The city produced optical instruments, precision machinery, and parts for aircraft and weapons. Its rail yards were among the most critical in eastern Germany, serving as a hub for troop movements and supply lines to the Eastern Front. Allied intelligence also believed that Dresden housed command posts and communication networks coordinating German defenses against the Soviet advance. These factors, while not on the scale of Berlin or Essen, made Dresden a legitimate target under the prevailing doctrines of strategic bombing. Yet critics argue that these justifications were thin at best. Many of the city's factories were located in the outskirts and suffered little damage. The main railway station was operational again within days, and the destruction was concentrated not on industrial or military sites, but on the densely populated Altstadt, the historic Old Town. This suggests that the raid's primary purpose was not to cripple Germany's war machine, but to inflict maximum psychological and human damage. The use of incendiaries, more than 3/4 of the bombs dropped, supports this conclusion. High explosive bombs destroy infrastructure. Incendiaries kill people and set cities ablaze. Another argument often cited by defenders of the raid is that Dresden was crowded with German troops and refugees, and thus a legitimate target. Indeed, as the Red Army advanced, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled westward, and many passed through Dresden. However, most historians agree that there were no significant concentrations of combat troops in the city. Refugees, largely women, children, and the elderly, made up a significant portion of the casualties. The fact that many shelters were poorly equipped and that the city had no effective fire defense only amplified the devastation. The bombing also had a diplomatic dimension that is often overlooked. By February 1945, the Allies were not only fighting Nazi Germany, they were preparing for the post-war world. Relations between the Western powers and the Soviet Union were already fraying. At the Yalta Conference, held just days before the Dresden raid, Joseph Stalin had requested that the Allies strike targets in eastern Germany to disrupt German movements and aid the Soviet advance. Dresden, located directly in the path of Soviet forces, fit this request perfectly. But there was another motive at play, a demonstration of Western air superiority. The inferno over Dresden was, in part, a signal to Moscow, a fiery reminder of the destructive capabilities of the Anglo-American alliance. The immediate aftermath of the bombing was apocalyptic. Survivors spoke of a hurricane of fire that swept through the city. People were sucked into the flames by powerful drafts, or suffocated as the firestorm consumed all available oxygen. Streets turned into rivers of molten asphalt. Bodies were reduced to ash or fused together in grotesque forms. Rescue workers found hundreds of corpses packed into basements and shelters, many without a mark on them, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. Entire families were wiped out in an instant. The psychological scars were just as deep. Dresden had long been known as the Florence on the Elbe, a city of beauty, refinement, and culture. Its destruction was not only a physical loss, but a cultural one. Priceless art collections, rare manuscripts, and architectural masterpieces were obliterated. The Frauenkirche, whose dome had defined the city's skyline for centuries, collapsed in a heap of blackened stones. The Zwinger, home to Raphael's Sistine Madonna and countless other treasures, was gutted. It would take decades to rebuild, and some losses could never be undone. In the post-war years, the tragedy of Dresden became a powerful tool for many different agendas. In Germany, particularly in the East, the bombing was used as a symbol of victimhood. The Soviet-backed government of East Germany portrayed Dresden as evidence of Western barbarism and used it to bolster anti-American sentiment. In the West, it fueled debates about the morality of strategic bombing and the limits of just war. Among the Allied nations, it became an uncomfortable chapter, one that did not fit neatly into the narrative of liberation and righteousness. For the survivors, however, the debates were often secondary to the trauma they carried. Many struggled with guilt for having lived when so many died, guilt for being part of a nation that had unleashed far greater horrors across Europe. Others felt bitterness and betrayal, believing that the Allies had crossed a moral line. The bombing of Dresden, more than most events of the war, forced individuals and nations alike to confront the uncomfortable reality that even a just cause can involve unjust actions. As historians have re-examined Dresden over the decades, new perspectives have emerged. Some scholars argue that the bombing, while horrific, was consistent with the logic of total war, a conflict in which civilian and military targets had become inseparable. They point to the Nazi regime's own campaigns of terror bombing, from Rotterdam to Coventry to London, as evidence that Germany had long abandoned any notion of restraint. They argue that, in a war of survival, Dresden was no different from Hamburg, Tokyo, or even Hiroshima, a tragic but inevitable consequence of industrialized warfare. Others reject this reasoning as moral relativism. They contend that the Allied cause was built on principles of justice, freedom, and human dignity, principles undermined by the deliberate annihilation of civilian populations. They note that the laws of war, even then, placed limits on what could be considered legitimate targets. Dresden, in their view, was not a military necessity, but a calculated act of terror, a war crime in all but name. The truth, as is often the case in history, lies somewhere in between. Dresden was not a simple story of good versus evil, of right versus wrong. It was the product of a brutal, totalizing war that blurred those lines beyond recognition. It was shaped by military logic, political calculation, and human emotion. Fear, rage, vengeance, and the desperate desire to end the bloodshed. It was, in many ways, both victory and vengeance. Today, Dresden stands rebuilt, its skyline once again dominated by the graceful dome of the Frauenkirche, painstakingly reconstructed from the original stones. The city has become a center for reconciliation and remembrance, hosting annual commemorations of the bombing and serving as a forum for dialogue about war, morality, and memory. Yet the ghosts of 1945 still linger. They whisper through the cobbled streets and shadowed courtyards. They remind us of what happens when war consumes reason, when humanity's highest ideals are drowned in fire. And so, the question remains, was Dresden a triumph of Allied resolve or a stain on their legacy? Was it a strategic necessity or a brutal punishment? Perhaps it was both, and perhaps that duality is what makes it so haunting. For in Dresden's destruction, we see not only the defeat of a monstrous regime, but also the terrible cost of that victory, a cost paid not by soldiers or generals, but by ordinary people whose only crime was to be in the wrong city on the wrong night. The debate over Dresden did not end with the guns of 1945. In fact, the controversy deepened as time passed, shaped by politics, ideology, and evolving notions of morality and warfare. What happened in Dresden became a mirror, one in which nations saw not only the actions of their enemies, but their own reflection. And for many, the image was deeply unsettling. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Allied powers were reluctant to examine Dresden too closely. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted German leaders for crimes against humanity and violations of the laws of war, including the bombing of civilian populations. Yet no Allied commander faced similar charges for the destruction of German or Japanese cities. The implicit argument was that the victors had fought a just war, and that their actions, however harsh, were justified by the need to defeat an evil regime. Dresden, therefore, was framed as part of a larger story of liberation, a necessary, if tragic, chapter in the defeat of Nazism. But the passage of time brought a more critical eye. In the 1950s and 1960s, as West Germany rebuilt and integrated into the Western Alliance, public discourse began to shift. The horrors of the Holocaust and Nazi aggression were fully exposed, but so too were the devastating consequences of Allied bombing. Writers, scholars, and survivors began to question whether the destruction of cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Würzburg had been militarily necessary. Were these raids acts of strategic precision, or were they deliberate campaigns of annihilation? One of the most influential voices in this debate was David Irving, a controversial British historian whose 1963 book, The Destruction of Dresden, brought renewed attention to the tragedy. Irving argued that Dresden had no significant military value and that the bombing was a calculated act of terror designed to impress the Soviets and punish the German people. He claimed the death toll was far higher than official estimates, suggesting as many as 135,000 people perished. These numbers were later debunked, and Irving's credibility was destroyed by his subsequent Holocaust denial. But his work helped reignite public debate and forced historians to re-examine the event in greater detail. In response, more rigorous scholarship emerged. Historians like Frederick Taylor, Donald Bloxham, and Götz Bergander painstakingly reconstructed the events of February 1945, cross-referencing archival documents, eyewitness accounts, and military records. Their work revealed a more nuanced picture. Dresden did have military significance, though perhaps not enough to justify the scale of the attack. The death toll, while horrific, was closer to 25,000 tarps, still immense, but far lower than Irving's claims. And while the bombing was certainly intended to break morale and assist the Soviet advance, it was also consistent with the strategic doctrines of the time. This complexity is often lost in popular memory, which prefers simple narratives: Dresden as an innocent victim, or Dresden as a necessary sacrifice. The reality is that it was both and neither. It was a city that housed cultural treasures and armaments factories, refugees, and railway hubs. It was both a symbol of Germany's cultural soul and a cog in its war machine. And it was destroyed by a campaign that was both militarily rational and morally troubling. One of the most significant legacies of Dresden is the way it has shaped post-war thinking about the ethics of bombing. The Second World War marked a turning point in the nature of conflict. For the first time, civilian populations became the primary targets of strategic campaigns. Cities were no longer sanctuaries, they were battlefields. The firebombing of Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo, and dozens of other urban centers demonstrated the terrifying potential of aerial warfare to annihilate entire communities in a single night. These lessons were not lost on military planners in the Cold War, who built strategies around the possibility of total destruction on an even greater scale. At the same time, Dresden helped fuel movements to limit and regulate warfare. The devastation of civilian populations during World War II led to new conventions and treaties designed to protect non-combatants and restrict the targeting of civilian infrastructure. While these laws have often been violated, they reflect an enduring lesson: that the horrors of Dresden must never be repeated. The city's fate became a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when strategic logic overrides human conscience. Yet Dresden's story is also deeply personal. Beyond the debates of historians and policymakers, it is a story of ordinary people, of mothers searching for their children in the ashes, of survivors wandering through streets they no longer recognized, of a city that had to rise from its own annihilation. Many of these stories remained untold for decades, buried beneath the rubble of politics and ideology. But they offer some of the most profound insights into the human cost of war. One such story is that of Lothar Metzger, who was 9 years old when the bombs fell. He remembered huddling in a basement as the building above him collapsed, then emerging into a world of fire and darkness. It was as bright as day, he later recalled. The heat was so intense that the soles of our shoes melted on the pavement. He and his family tried to flee, but the firestorm surrounded them. They survived by sheer luck, but thousands of others did not. Another survivor, Anneliese Schertz, described how the streets were lined with charred bodies, many locked in the final moments of terror. They were kneeling, praying, embracing, she said. It was as if time had stopped. The smell of burning flesh lingered for weeks. The city's rivers were clogged with corpses. The trauma was so overwhelming that many survivors refused to speak of it for the rest of their lives. For decades, The ruins of Dresden stood as a silent witness to that night. The blackened shell of the Frauenkirche remained untouched, a haunting reminder of destruction. It was not until after German reunification in 1990 that efforts to rebuild it began in earnest. Using original stones salvaged from the rubble, architects and craftsmen painstakingly restored the church to its former glory. When it was finally reopened in 2005, it was not only a triumph of engineering, but a powerful symbol of reconciliation, a message that even the deepest wounds can heal. The city itself has embraced this role as a bridge between past and future. Every February 13th, thousands gather in Dresden to remember the bombing and to reflect on the lessons it teaches. Candlelight vigils, silent marches, and interfaith services mark the anniversary. The emphasis is not on blame or revenge, but on peace and understanding. Dresden's leaders have worked to transform the city from a symbol of destruction into a beacon of hope, a place where the horrors of the past inspire a commitment to a more humane future. And yet, the memory of Dresden remains contested. Far-right groups in Germany have attempted to exploit the tragedy, using it to promote revisionist narratives that minimize Nazi crimes and portray Germans solely as victims. In response, historians and civic leaders have fought to preserve historical accuracy, to remember that the bombing, however devastating, did not occur in a vacuum. It was part of a war unleashed by Nazi aggression, a war that saw tens of millions perish across Europe and beyond. Acknowledging the suffering of Dresden's civilians does not absolve Germany of its responsibility for that war, but it does remind us that humanity is often the first casualty of total conflict. The tension between remembrance and responsibility is one of the defining features of Dresden's legacy. It is a tension reflected in the city's memorial culture, its public debates, and even its architecture. On one hand, Dresden mourns, and rightly so, the immense suffering endured by its people in February 1945. On the other, it acknowledges that this suffering occurred in the context of a global catastrophe that Germany itself unleashed. This dual memory is difficult, but it is essential. It prevents history from being weaponized, either as justification for vengeance or as fuel for denial. One of the most striking examples of this balanced approach is the Weißer-Hirsch Declaration, a statement issued by Dresden City Council in the 1990s. It explicitly recognized the bombing as both a tragedy and a consequence of Nazi aggression. "We remember the victims of the air raids," it read, "but we also remember the victims of German crimes in Warsaw, Rotterdam, Coventry, and countless other cities." This dual remembrance is now at the heart of Dresden's commemorative practices. The message is clear. Mourning one's own dead must never mean forgetting those who died at one's hands. Internationally, Dresden has also become a focal point for reconciliation. In the post-war decades, the city established partnerships with many of the nations once arrayed against it. Coventry, itself devastated by German bombing in 1940, became a twin city in a powerful gesture of forgiveness and shared memory. Survivors from both sides met, shared their stories, and pledged to ensure that future generations would learn from their suffering. Japanese delegations from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities that suffered similar fates, have participated in memorial events. These exchanges underscore a universal truth. While nations wage war, it is civilians everywhere who pay the highest price. The symbolism of Dresden has also influenced global debates about the ethics of war in the modern age. In the 1990s, as NATO bombed Belgrade during the Kosovo conflict, critics drew comparisons to Dresden, questioning whether the destruction of infrastructure and civilian areas could ever be morally justified. Similar arguments emerged during the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and again during conflicts in Syria and Ukraine. Dresden is often invoked, not because the situations are identical, but because it represents a broader question, one that humanity still struggles to answer. Can there be such a thing as a humane war? Military technology has advanced far beyond the era of Lancaster bombers and B-17s. Precision-guided munitions, drones, and satellite surveillance have made it theoretically possible to target military objectives with unprecedented accuracy. Yet civilian casualties remain a grim reality of modern conflict. Cities continue to be bombed, infrastructure continues to collapse, and innocent lives continue to be lost. Dresden's story reminds us that technology cannot solve the moral dilemmas of war. Only humanity can. The firestorm over Dresden also offers insight into the psychology of war. Strategic bombing was not just about destroying infrastructure, it was about breaking will. The British government, scarred by the Blitz and driven by a desire to strike back, embraced area bombing as a form of psychological warfare. The goal was to shatter civilian morale, to convince the German people that their government could not protect them, and to hasten surrender. Yet history shows that this strategy was flawed. Despite the devastation of their cities, the German population did not rise against Hitler. If anything, the bombings hardened their resolve. Fear turned into defiance, suffering into endurance. The same pattern repeated itself in Japan, where even the atomic bombings did not force surrender until other military and political pressures converged. This raises a troubling question. Was the suffering inflicted on Dresden and on countless other cities truly necessary to win the war? Or was it a product of flawed assumptions about human nature? Modern research suggests that societies under attack often become more cohesive, not less. They rally around their leaders, however despised, and resist even harder. If this is true, then the destruction of Dresden was not only morally questionable, it may also have been strategically misguided. Yet it is important not to judge the decisions of 1945 solely by the standards of today. The Allied leaders and planners who ordered the bombing believed they were fighting an existential war, a war against a regime that had enslaved and exterminated millions. They knew that every day the war continued, thousands more would die in concentration camps, on battlefields, and under occupation. They were under immense pressure to end the conflict as quickly as possible. In that context, any action that might shorten the war, however brutal, seemed justified. Dresden was, in part, the product of that desperation. This does not absolve the bombing of its horror, but it does explain it. It reminds us that even the most abhorrent acts can be committed by those who believe they are doing what is necessary. And it warns us that morality in war is not a fixed compass. It is a shifting calculation, shaped by fear, rage, and survival. Today, Dresden stands as a testament to both destruction and resilience. The city has rebuilt itself not just physically, but spiritually. It has embraced its past without being defined by it. It has become a place where difficult conversations happen about guilt and grief, justice and revenge, war and peace. It has turned tragedy into a tool for education, using its own history to teach future generations about the dangers of hatred and the fragility of civilization. In the heart of the rebuilt city stands the Trümmerfrau Monument, a tribute to the women who cleared the rubble and laid the foundations for Dresden's rebirth. Many of them had lost everything: homes, families, futures. Yet they rebuilt. Stone by stone, they restored what had been lost. Their story is a powerful metaphor for the human spirit, a reminder that even from the ashes of total destruction, life can begin again. Perhaps this is Dresden's greatest lesson. War can destroy cities, erase cultures, and kill millions. but it cannot extinguish the human capacity for renewal. The same species that created firestorms is also capable of rebuilding cathedrals, forging peace, and learning from its mistakes. The tragedy of Dresden is not only a story of death, it is also a story of rebirth. Still, the question remains, as haunting as the ruins that once scarred the city. Was Dresden necessary? Was it justified? Was it victory or vengeance? These are questions that historians, ethicists, and ordinary people will continue to debate for generations. They have no simple answers. Perhaps they never will. What is certain is this: Dresden forces us to confront the darkest truths about ourselves. It reminds us that even the most righteous causes can lead to monstrous acts. It shows us how easily the line between justice and revenge can blur. And it challenges us, all of us, to think deeply about the kind of world we want to build when the fires finally die down. In the end, the story of Dresden is not just about 1945. It is about every war, every bombing, every decision to unleash destruction in the name of victory. It is a warning carved into history that the path to peace must never again be paved with the ashes of cities. It is a plea, from the dead to the living, to find better ways to resolve our conflicts, to build a world where such choices are no longer thinkable. The firestorm that consumed Dresden burned for days, but its flames still cast a long shadow across the decades. It is up to us whether that shadow serves as a monument to our capacity for cruelty or as a guidepost toward something better. The significance of Dresden extends beyond its immediate historical context. It has become a lens through which we examine not only the morality of World War II, but also the evolution of warfare and humanity's relationship with violence itself. In this sense, Dresden is less a single event than a profound moral question, one that resurfaces with every bomb dropped on a city, every civilian casualty reported in the news, every time nations justify destruction in the name of security or justice. In the post-war decades, strategic bombing continued to shape military doctrine. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, each saw the use of overwhelming aerial firepower to achieve political and military objectives. Civilian areas were often caught in the crossfire, and despite advances in technology, the human cost remained staggering. Cities like Pyongyang, Hanoi, Baghdad, and Fallujah all experienced devastation that, in scale, if not in intensity, echoed Dresden. Yet the debates over these campaigns also echoed Dresden. Was the destruction necessary? Was it proportional? Were we targeting the enemy or punishing a population? These questions are not merely academic. They strike at the heart of how we define justice in war, how we balance military necessity against human suffering, and how we judge the actions of nations in moments of existential crisis. Dresden has become a benchmark against which these decisions are measured, a historical precedent cited by generals and politicians, activists, and historians alike. Its name is invoked as both justification and condemnation, as warning and as excuse. But Dresden also teaches us something deeper about ourselves. It exposes the contradictions within human nature, our capacity for both compassion and cruelty, for art and annihilation. It shows that even societies that cherish beauty, music, and culture can unleash unimaginable violence. The same nation that produced Goethe and Beethoven also produced Auschwitz, and the same coalition that liberated Europe from tyranny also incinerated Dresden. This duality is not unique to World War II. It is a constant in human history, a reminder that civilization and savagery are often separated by the thinnest of lines. The cultural loss in Dresden was almost as profound as the human one. The city had been a center of enlightenment and creativity for centuries. Its museums housed works by masters like Rembrandt, Rubens, and Raphael. Its opera house was one of Europe's most celebrated. Its architecture, a harmonious blend of Baroque and Rococo, was renowned worldwide. Much of that heritage was reduced to rubble in a single night. The firestorm destroyed not just buildings, but memory, a physical embodiment of centuries of human achievement. This, too, is part of the tragedy. War does not merely kill people. It erases culture, identity, and history itself. The deliberate targeting of cultural heritage, or its collateral destruction, raises another layer of moral complexity. Are such losses inevitable in war, or should they be treated as war crimes? International law has increasingly recognized the latter. The 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property was a direct response to the destruction of cities like Dresden. It sought to establish legal protections for monuments, museums, and historic sites. Yet even today, cultural heritage remains vulnerable. From the Buddhas of Bamiyan to the ruins of Palmyra, war continues to erase humanity's shared past. Dresden's fate serves as a powerful reminder of why those protections are necessary and why they so often fail. The memory of Dresden has also influenced literature, film, and art. Perhaps the most famous literary response is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, a semi-autobiographical novel based on his own experiences as a prisoner of war during the bombing. Vonnegut's depiction of Dresden is surreal and haunting, blending absurdity and horror to capture the incomprehensibility of mass destruction. "So it goes," he wrote, a refrain repeated throughout the book, a resigned acknowledgement of humanity's endless capacity for violence. The novel helped shape public consciousness of Dresden, especially in the United States, and remains one of the most powerful anti-war statements in modern literature. Other artists, filmmakers, and musicians have grappled with Dresden's legacy. Paintings depict the inferno in apocalyptic tones. Documentaries piece together the stories of survivors. Orchestral works mourn the city's lost beauty. These cultural responses serve not only as memorials, but as acts of resistance, ways of reclaiming meaning from senseless destruction. They remind us that even in the face of annihilation, the human spirit seeks to create, to remember, to make sense of the past. It is also worth examining how Dresden's memory has evolved within Germany itself. In the early post-war years, especially in East Germany, the bombing was portrayed as a symbol of Western imperialist aggression. The narrative often downplayed or ignored Nazi crimes, framing Germans solely as victims. In the West, discussions of Dresden were more muted, overshadowed by the need to confront Germany's responsibility for the Holocaust and the war. Over time, however, a more balanced narrative emerged, one that recognized German suffering without erasing German guilt. This evolution reflects Germany's broader struggle with its past, a process known as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. Today, most Germans view Dresden through a dual lens, as a horrific tragedy and as a consequence of a war their nation started. School curricula, museums, and public commemorations emphasize both aspects. This nuanced approach is vital, for it allows societies to mourn their dead without succumbing to denial or revisionism. It is a model for how nations might confront their darkest chapters, honestly, comprehensively, and without excuses. In this context, the firebombing of Dresden transcends national boundaries. It is no longer just a German tragedy or an Allied decision. It is a human story, one that speaks to universal themes of war, morality, and memory. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, that justice and vengeance often look alike, that the line between military necessity and atrocity is easily crossed, that even the most noble causes can produce monstrous consequences. And it reminds us that the victims of war are not just soldiers or states. They are mothers and children, artists and laborers, entire communities whose lives are erased in an instant. The continuing resonance of Dresden's story suggests that it has something vital to teach us, not about the past, but about the present and future. As humanity faces new forms of warfare, cyber attacks, drone strikes, autonomous weapons, the fundamental questions remain the same. How do we wage war without losing our humanity? How do we balance security and morality? How do we ensure that necessity does not become an excuse for cruelty? Perhaps the answer lies in remembrance itself. By confronting the horrors of Dresden honestly, by studying them, teaching them, and reflecting on them, we keep their lessons alive. We remind ourselves of the costs of total war, of the fragility of civilization, and of the responsibility that comes with power. We cannot undo the past, but we can choose what we learn from it and how we let it shape the future. In the end, Dresden's story is not just about fire and destruction. It is also about resilience, memory, and the enduring struggle to define what it means to be human in an inhuman world. It is about the choices we make and the consequences that follow. It is a story written in ash and stone, in sorrow and hope. And it continues to ask us, across the decades, when we wage war, do we seek victory or vengeance? And are we wise enough to know the difference? As the decades lengthen and the living memory of World War II fades, the bombing of Dresden still refuses to rest quietly in the pages of history. It resurfaces in political speeches, in ethical debates, in classroom discussions, and even in the rhetoric of modern conflicts. Its continued presence is proof that Dresden was not just a military operation. It was a moral event, one that forces every generation to confront the hardest truths about war and humanity. One reason Dresden endures so powerfully is because it defies simplistic categorization. It is not merely a story of Allied triumph or German victimhood. It is not a clear-cut case of military necessity or naked revenge. Instead, it exists in a gray space, a place where the lines between good and evil, justice and atrocity, victory and vengeance blur and overlap. It is precisely this ambiguity that makes Dresden so unsettling. It does not offer easy answers. It demands uncomfortable questions. Among those questions, perhaps the most enduring is this: can the ends ever truly justify the means? The Allied leaders believed they were justified, that anything which hastened the defeat of Nazi Germany was worth doing. And indeed, the destruction of the Third Reich was one of the most urgent moral imperatives in human history. The Holocaust was still raging in February 1945. Millions remained enslaved, imprisoned, and oppressed. The faster the war ended, the more lives would be saved. But Dresden compels us to ask whether there is a point at which the cost of victory becomes too high, whether some methods, no matter how expedient, compromise the very values for which the war is fought. The philosopher Michael Walzer, in his influential work, Just and Unjust Wars, uses Dresden as a case study in the ethics of wartime conduct. He argues that while total war may seem to render morality irrelevant, it is precisely in moments of total war that morality becomes most essential. If the fight against tyranny requires us to adopt the tyrant's methods, then victory risks becoming hollow. The Allies won the war, but Dresden forces us to ask, at what cost to their moral authority? This question has echoed through subsequent conflicts. During the Vietnam War, critics compared the carpet bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong to Dresden. During the First Gulf War, when coalition forces struck Baghdad's infrastructure, human rights groups invoked Dresden as a warning. Even in the 21st century, as drone strikes kill civilians far from traditional battlefields, the specter of Dresden lingers. It serves as a reminder that the logic of war, the belief that killing civilians can shorten conflicts and save lives, remains as seductive and as dangerous as ever. Dresden also raises profound questions about memory, about how societies remember their past and how those memories shape their identity. In Germany, the memory of Dresden has evolved from silence to politicization to reconciliation. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many survivors were too traumatized to speak. The sheer scale of suffering defied language. But as the Cold War intensified, memory became a weapon. The East German government portrayed Dresden as evidence of capitalist barbarism, a narrative that conveniently ignored the city's role in the Nazi war effort. In the West, public discussion was muted, overshadowed by the need to confront the Holocaust and to rebuild a democratic state. It was only after reunification that a more honest and nuanced memory began to emerge. Historians, artists, and citizens engaged in open dialogue about the bombing, acknowledging both the immense suffering of Dresden's people and the broader context of Nazi aggression. Memorials were built not only to the victims of February 1945, but also to the victims of Nazi crimes. Museums explored the bombing as part of a larger story, one that included German culpability and Allied responsibility alike. This approach, though painful, created a deeper, more meaningful understanding of the past. It allowed Dresden to become not a symbol of blame or denial, but a catalyst for reflection. The process of remembrance is not merely academic, it has real consequences. How societies remember events like Dresden influences how they respond to future crises. A memory that focuses solely on victimhood risks fostering resentment and revisionism. A memory that ignores suffering risks perpetuating indifference and injustice. A balanced memory, one that acknowledges complexity, admits wrongdoing, and honors all victims, can promote empathy, reconciliation, and a commitment to peace. For this reason, Dresden has become a central case study in memory culture around the world. Its lessons inform how nations remember colonialism, genocide, slavery, and other historical atrocities. They teach that memory must be inclusive and truthful, even when truth is uncomfortable. They remind us that mourning is not weakness, and that confronting one's own crimes is not betrayal, but strength. Even today, Dresden's memory is contested. Far-right groups in Germany attempt to exploit the bombing as proof of German victimhood, downplaying Nazi atrocities and equating the Allied raids with the Holocaust. These efforts are fiercely resisted by historians, educators, and civic organizations, who emphasize that context matters, that while the suffering of Dresden civilians is real and deserves remembrance, it cannot be divorced from the broader story of Nazi aggression. The battle over Dresden's memory is, in many ways, a battle over the meaning of history itself, a struggle to ensure that the past is neither forgotten nor distorted. As the 21st century unfolds, Dresden continues to speak to us. Its ruins, both physical and symbolic, remind us of the catastrophic power of war and the fragility of civilization. Its rebuilt skyline, crowned once again by the Frauenkirche, stands as a testament to resilience and reconciliation. And its story, retold in classrooms, documentaries, and memorial ceremonies, continues to challenge and inspire. Ultimately, Dresden is more than an event to be studied. It is a moral touchstone, a point of reference against which we measure ourselves. It asks us, again and again, who we are and what we are willing to become. It forces us to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that victory and vengeance can look alarmingly similar, and that the difference between them often lies not in the bombs we drop, but in the reasons we choose to drop them. And perhaps that is Dresden's final lesson. War is not just about tactics and strategies, weapons and targets. It is about choices, choices made by leaders, by nations, and by individuals. Those choices shape not only the outcome of battles, but the character of the societies that wage them. The bombing of Dresden was one such choice, a choice that ended lives, erased a city, and scarred history itself. Whether it was justified or unforgivable is a debate that will never truly end. But by confronting that choice, by examining it honestly and fearlessly, we come closer to understanding the terrible responsibilities that come with power. As the firestorm faded and the ashes settled in February 1945, the survivors of Dresden stumbled through a landscape that seemed alien, almost lunar. Their city, once vibrant and beautiful, was now a wasteland. But amid the devastation, life persisted. People dug through the rubble for loved ones. Churches held services among the ruins. Musicians played in makeshift concert halls. Slowly, painfully, Dresden began to live again. That resilience, that refusal to be defined by destruction, may be the most enduring victory of all. The rebirth of Dresden in the decades following the war is itself a story worth telling. A story that transforms the narrative from one of annihilation to one of endurance, memory, and human determination. The people who returned to the ruins did not simply rebuild a city, they resurrected a soul. They took the scars of the past and turned them into the foundation of a future defined not by vengeance, but by understanding. The reconstruction of Dresden was neither quick nor easy. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, the scale of devastation was overwhelming. More than 75,000 buildings had been destroyed or damaged. The city center was a charred skeleton. The infrastructure, roads, bridges, utilities, was in ruins. And yet, people came back. They cleared rubble by hand. They built makeshift shelters from the remains of shattered homes. They re-established schools, hospitals, and markets. It was a process measured not in months or years, but in generations. One of the most iconic symbols of Dresden's resurrection is the Frauenkirche. For decades, its blackened ruins stood untouched, a stark reminder of the firestorm's fury. Many in the German Democratic Republic, GDR, wanted it to remain that way, a permanent memorial to the destruction of war. But after reunification, the people of Dresden chose a different path. They launched an ambitious project to rebuild the church exactly as it had been, using original stones wherever possible. The reconstruction took 13 years and relied on meticulous historical research, advanced engineering, and donations from around the world. When the Frauenkirche was finally rededicated in 2005, it was more than a building restored. It was a symbol of reconciliation, unity, and hope. Other landmarks followed. The Semperoper, destroyed in the bombing, was rebuilt and reopened in 1985. The Zwinger Palace, with its Baroque splendor, was painstakingly restored. Museums, galleries, and libraries rose from the ashes, preserving the cultural legacy that the firestorm had tried to erase. The city's skyline, once dominated by rubble, regained its graceful silhouette. Yet the reconstruction was never about erasing the past. On the contrary, Dresden deliberately preserved remnants of destruction: blackened stones, scorched walls, fragments of collapsed structures, as part of the new architecture. They serve as silent witnesses, reminding future generations of what was lost and why. The rebuilding of Dresden also reflected broader changes in Germany's national identity. The post-war period forced the country to confront its past, not just the destruction it suffered, but the destruction it caused. This confrontation was painful, but it was necessary. It allowed Germany to evolve from a pariah state into a stable democracy, from a perpetrator of war crimes into a champion of peace and human rights. Dresden's restoration was part of this transformation, a tangible expression of Germany's commitment to remember, to atone, and to move forward. This commitment is most visible every February 13th, when Dresden pauses to remember the firestorm. The city's commemorations are striking not for their pageantry, but for their humility. There are no military parades, no triumphal speeches. Instead, there are candlelight vigils, silent marches, and moments of reflection. Survivors share their stories. Church bells toll. Citizens gather on the rebuilt Altmarkt to hold hands in a human chain, a living symbol of peace and solidarity. These rituals are not about assigning blame. They are about acknowledging pain, all pain, and vowing that such destruction will never happen again. Yet Dresden's commemorations have not been without controversy. In recent years, far-right groups have attempted to hijack the memorial events, using them to push revisionist narratives that portray Germans solely as victims and equate Allied bombing with Nazi atrocities. Such distortions have been met with strong resistance from historians, educators, and civil society. The city government has taken firm steps to ensure that remembrance remains truthful and inclusive. Counter-demonstrations, educational campaigns, and public debates have helped reclaim the narrative. Dresden remembers, but it remembers honestly. This emphasis on honest memory is what gives Dresden's story its enduring power. It is not a sanitized narrative of victimhood. It is a complex, painful, and deeply human story, one that includes both suffering and guilt, destruction and renewal. It acknowledges that Dresden was a victim of war, but also part of a nation that unleashed unprecedented violence. It recognizes the cruelty of the firestorm, but also the context in which it occurred. This honesty does not diminish Dresden's tragedy. It deepens it. It transforms it from a tale of isolated suffering into a universal lesson about the consequences of hatred, extremism, and total war. And those lessons remain urgently relevant today. The 20th century did not end with Dresden. Cities have continued to burn in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Syria, and Ukraine. Civilians have continued to die. The moral dilemmas that haunted 1945 still haunt us now. The weapons may be more precise, the rhetoric more refined, but the essential question remains the same. How far are we willing to go in the pursuit of victory? How much destruction can we justify in the name of security, freedom, or justice? Dresden offers no simple answers, but it does offer guidance. It teaches that military power must always be tempered by moral responsibility. It warns that even the most righteous cause can be corrupted by hatred and vengeance. It reminds us that the line between defense and destruction, between justice and atrocity, is perilously thin. And it shows us that the aftermath of war, the rebuilding, the remembering, the reconciliation, is as important as the war itself. Perhaps most importantly, Dresden teaches us about the resilience of the human spirit. The same people who watched their city burn in 1945 rebuilt it from nothing. The same streets that once ran with fire now hum with life. The same squares that were filled with ashes now host music, festivals, markets, and celebrations. Dresden is not just a symbol of destruction. It is a testament to humanity's capacity to endure, to heal, and to hope. This duality, destruction and rebirth, vengeance and reconciliation, is what makes Dresden's story timeless. It is a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a tragedy and a triumph. It shows us the worst we are capable of and the best. It forces us to confront the darkness within us, but also to believe that we can overcome it. As the sun sets over the Elbe today, its waters reflecting the golden dome of the rebuilt Frauenkirche, it is hard to imagine the inferno that once consumed this place. The city that was meant to be erased from history now stands as one of Europe's cultural capitals, a center of art, science, and music once again. Its museums are filled with treasures. Its streets are alive with voices. Its churches ring with song. Dresden lives, not in spite of its past, but because of it. And that is perhaps the final paradox of Dresden. The firestorm that was meant to destroy it forever instead ensured that it would never be forgotten. The city's suffering became its strength. Its ashes became the soil from which new life grew. Its memory, painful, complicated, and unresolved, became a guide for future generations. So, when we ask whether Dresden was victory or vengeance, perhaps the answer is neither. Perhaps it was a lesson, one written in fire and stone, in sorrow and resilience, a lesson about the cost of war, the weight of choices, and the enduring power of humanity to rebuild even after the darkest night. And if we learn that lesson, truly learn it, then perhaps the dead of Dresden will not have died in vain. The story of Dresden, though anchored in one terrible night of February 1945, has grown beyond its historical boundaries. It has become a moral parable, a cultural touchstone, and a warning etched into the collective memory of humanity. Yet it is also deeply personal, a mosaic of countless individual experiences, many of which still ripple quietly through families and generations today. To fully understand Dresden's place in history, we must listen not only to the voices of generals, politicians, and historians, but also to the whispers of those who lived and died through the inferno. Many survivors of Dresden's firestorm carried their trauma in silence for decades. The horror was simply too great, too raw, too impossible to express. Some were children when the bombs fell, their memories fragmented into flashes of fire, screams, and darkness. Others were adults who had lived through years of war, but nothing had prepared them for the night when the sky itself turned against them. Their stories, when they finally emerged, painted a picture of suffering that transcended politics or ideology. One survivor, Erika Schmidt, remembered fleeing through the burning streets with her younger brother. The air was so hot it seared their lungs. The ground was so soft with ash that they stumbled with every step. At one point, they turned down a street only to find it blocked by a wall of flame. The firestorm had created a vortex that sucked in oxygen and hurled debris like a hurricane. It was as if the city had become a living thing, she recalled, an angry, roaring beast devouring everything. They survived by crawling into a cellar already filled with corpses. "We lay there for hours," she said, listening to the world burn. Another witness, a British prisoner of war named Victor Gregg, had been interned in Dresden before the bombing. He remembered emerging from the ruins days later to find the city unrecognizable. There were no streets, no buildings, only a desert of rubble and twisted iron, he said. The smell was everywhere. That sickly sweet stench of burning flesh. It clung to your clothes, your hair, your skin. You could not wash it away. For the rest of his life, Gregg questioned whether the bombing had been necessary. "I knew the Nazis had to be defeated," he admitted, "but I also knew that what I saw in Dresden was not victory. It was something else, something darker." Stories like these reveal the human dimension of Dresden, a dimension often lost amid statistics and strategy. They remind us that war is not fought on maps or in command centers, but in homes, streets, and human bodies. They strip away the abstractions of military necessity and expose the raw reality of suffering. And they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that in war, it is almost always the innocent who suffer most. Yet amid this darkness, there were also moments of humanity, small acts of kindness and solidarity that flickered like candles in the inferno. Neighbors risked their lives to pull strangers from collapsing buildings. Priests and doctors, tended to the wounded in makeshift shelters. Foreign prisoners shared their rations with German civilians. Even in the depths of destruction, the bonds of compassion endured. These stories are just as much a part of Dresden's legacy as the firestorm itself. They remind us that even when humanity shows its worst, it is still capable of its best. The firebombing of Dresden also left a profound psychological mark on those who ordered and carried out the raids. Many Allied airmen, though convinced they were serving a just cause, were haunted by what they had done. Some refused to talk about their missions. Others expressed regret later in life. Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, the architect of Britain's area bombing strategy, never apologized. He believed that the raids had helped end the war. Yet even he admitted that Dresden went a little too far. Some American pilots, interviewed decades later, described looking down at the firestorm below and realizing they were witnessing something beyond war, something that felt like annihilation itself. The bombing also shaped post-war military thinking in ways that extended far beyond Germany. In the early Cold War, strategists studied Dresden as both a success and a cautionary tale. It demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of concentrated bombing, but it also revealed its political and moral costs. As nuclear weapons entered the equation, Dresden became a point of reference for discussions about deterrence, proportionality, and the ethics of total destruction. The phrase Dresden effect entered military vocabulary as shorthand for overwhelming, often indiscriminate force, a phenomenon to be both feared and avoided. Cultural memory of Dresden continued to evolve as well. In the 1960s and 70s, the city's story became a rallying cry for pacifist movements around the world. Anti-war activists cited Dresden alongside Hiroshima and Nagasaki as evidence of the madness of modern conflict. Artists and writers used it as a metaphor for humanity's self-destructive impulses. Philosophers invoked it in debates about morality and responsibility, and survivors, once silent, began to speak publicly, ensuring that their suffering would not be forgotten. By the 1990s, as the Cold War ended and Germany reunified, Dresden's memory entered a new phase, one characterized by dialogue and reconciliation. Former Allied airmen were invited to memorial events. Survivors met with those who had once been their enemies. Apologies were offered, and forgiveness, in many cases, was given. These gestures did not erase the past, but they transformed it. They turned wounds into bridges. They showed that even the deepest scars could be healed by truth and understanding. Today, Dresden is more than a rebuilt city. It is a living memorial. Its museums and memorials do not glorify war. They question it. Exhibitions explore not just the bombing, but also the Nazi policies that led to war, the Allied decisions that shaped it, and the global consequences that followed. School children visit these sites not to learn about battles, but to learn about choices, the choices that lead to destruction, and the choices that lead away from it. International visitors often remark on the humility and honesty of Dresden's remembrance culture. There are no grand monuments celebrating military might, no triumphalist narratives. Instead, there are quiet spaces of reflection, plaques, stones, sculptures that invite contemplation. One such memorial, the Monument to the Victims of the Bombing, bears a simple inscription. This was their home. This was their life. Let us remember. It is a reminder that behind every statistic is a human story, and that those stories deserve to be remembered. And perhaps this is the final transformation of Dresden's tragedy. What began as an act of destruction has become a force for reflection. What was once a scar is now a lesson. What was once a symbol of vengeance is now a plea for peace. Yet the story is not over. As global tensions rise, As new technologies make destruction ever more efficient, as nationalism and hatred once again find footholds in the world, Dresden's warning feels more urgent than ever. Its lesson is clear. When we abandon restraint, when we dehumanize our enemies, when we convince ourselves that anything is justified in the name of victory, we risk becoming the very thing we fight against. The firestorm of 1945 is long extinguished, but its embers still glow in the conscience of humanity. They remind us of our capacity for violence and for compassion. They challenge us to build a future where cities do not burn and civilians do not perish. And they ask us, one final time, the question that echoes across the ruins of history. Was Dresden victory? Was it vengeance? Or was it a mirror, reflecting not the evil of one side or the other, but the darkness that lives within us all? The answer may never be simple, but in seeking it, honestly and without illusions, we honor the memory of those who lived and died in the firestorm. And perhaps in doing so, we take one small step toward ensuring that such a night never comes again. To speak of Dresden is to speak of humanity itself, our brilliance and our brutality, our capacity to create beauty and to destroy it, our yearning for peace, and our relentless march toward war. The firestorm that consumed Dresden in February 1945 is not merely a story from the past. It is a mirror held up to our nature. And if we look deeply into that mirror, we see more than bombs and flames. We see the choices that shaped them, the beliefs that justified them, and the consequences that followed. Even today, nearly a century later, Dresden forces military strategists and political leaders to confront questions that have no easy answers. What constitutes a legitimate target in war? How many civilian deaths are acceptable in the pursuit of victory? Where is the line between deterrence and terror, between necessity and excess? The bombing of Dresden, with its mixture of military rationale, political calculation, and moral controversy, remains a case study in the ambiguity of these questions. In modern military academies, Dresden is often used as a scenario for ethical debates. Cadets are asked to imagine themselves as Allied planners in February 1945. They have intelligence suggesting that Dresden is a transportation hub supporting German forces on the Eastern Front. They know that destroying it could disrupt enemy logistics. But they also know the city is crowded with refugees and civilians, and that the bombing could kill tens of thousands. Do they order the attack? If so, how do they justify it? If not, how do they explain the possible prolongation of the war and the lives that might be lost as a result? These exercises are not about finding right answers. They are about grappling with the reality that in war, there are often no right answers, only degrees of wrong. And perhaps this is the most disturbing lesson of Dresden, that war itself is a moral failure, one that corrupts even the noblest intentions. When nations go to war, they enter a realm where choices are rarely clear, where victory and atrocity can be separated by inches, and where even the defenders of justice can commit acts that haunt them for generations. Dresden is not unique in this regard. Hiroshima, My Lai, Fallujah, Mariupol. The list is long and growing. But Dresden was among the first to reveal this truth on such an overwhelming scale. It showed the world that even the good war, the war fought against tyranny, could produce horrors that defy justification. For survivors and descendants, the legacy of Dresden is not just historical, but deeply personal. Families still pass down stories of that night, stories of loss, survival, and resilience. Memorial services still draw those whose parents or grandparents perished in the firestorm. In many homes, faded photographs and fragments of rubble are cherished as relics, physical links to a past that refuses to fade. And in these memories, one can sense a profound paradox. Grief intertwined with forgiveness, anger tempered by understanding. Many survivors, even those who lost everything, did not harbor hatred toward the Allies. Some spoke of their belief that the bombing, however cruel, was part of a larger struggle against evil. Others expressed empathy for the airmen who dropped the bombs, recognizing that they too were victims of war, of orders, of circumstances beyond their control. "We were all trapped," said one survivor decades later. "They were trapped in their planes. We were trapped in our cellars. None of us wanted it to happen. But it happened." This ability to see humanity even in one's enemy is one of Dresden's most remarkable legacies. It reflects a profound understanding, born of suffering, that vengeance solves nothing, that hatred perpetuates the cycle of violence, and that the only way forward is through empathy and reconciliation. This spirit is woven into the fabric of modern Dresden. It can be seen in the partnerships the city has forged with former adversaries, in the collaborative research projects and cultural exchanges that now define its global role, and in the annual peace conferences and dialogues it hosts. The city's transformation into a beacon of peace is perhaps best symbolized by the Dresden Peace Prize, established in 2010. Awarded annually, it honors individuals and organizations that work toward peace, human rights, and understanding between peoples. Recipients have included whistleblowers, dissidents, humanitarians, and activists, people who, in their own ways, fight to prevent the kind of destruction Dresden endured. The prize is more than an award. It is a statement, a declaration that Dresden's suffering has been transformed into a commitment to a better world. And yet, the world remains perilous. The very forces that led to Dresden, nationalism, militarism, propaganda, and fear, are still with us. In some places, they are resurgent. Once again, civilians find themselves trapped in cities turned into battlegrounds. Once again, leaders justify atrocities as necessary or inevitable. Once again, bombs fall from the sky in the name of security. Dresden's lesson is clear, but humanity's memory is short. This is why remembrance is so vital. To remember Dresden is not to dwell on the past, but to guard against its repetition. It is to recognize the warning signs, the dehumanizing language, the escalating rhetoric, the incremental erosion of moral boundaries, before they lead to catastrophe. It is to teach future generations that war is not an abstraction, but a brutal, intimate reality that devours everything in its path. And it is to remind ourselves that the decisions we make, as nations, as leaders, as individuals, have consequences that echo far beyond our own time. Perhaps the ultimate legacy of Dresden is its refusal to be reduced to a single meaning. It is not simply a story of Allied aggression or German suffering, of military strategy or civilian tragedy. It is all of these and more. It is a story about the complexity of war, the fragility of morality, and the resilience of the human spirit. It is a story that belongs not just to Germans, or to Britons, or to Americans, but to all of humanity. It is also, in a way, a story about hope. For if Dresden shows us the depths of destruction, it also shows us the heights of renewal. If it reveals the darkness of war, it also illuminates the light of peace. The city that once symbolized humanity's capacity for violence now symbolizes its capacity for healing. The ruins that once testified to our worst impulses now testify to our best. And in that transformation lies a profound message, that no matter how devastating the past, the future is ours to shape. When the Allied bombers roared away into the night sky on February 15, 1945, Dresden lay silent, a blackened, smoking shell of its former self. Few could have imagined that the city would ever rise again. Fewer still could have imagined that it would rise not as a monument to revenge or hatred, but as a symbol of peace and reconciliation. Yet that is precisely what it has become. Dresden is living proof that even the deepest wounds can heal, that even the darkest nights can give way to dawn. The story of Dresden is not over, and perhaps it never will be. As long as war exists, as long as bombs fall and civilians suffer, Dresden will remain relevant. It will remain a question, a warning, and a lesson. And it will continue to whisper its message to those who care to listen. Remember what happened here. Remember what war truly means. Remember what we are capable of, both in destruction and in redemption. And above all, remember that the future is still unwritten. It is up to us whether that future will be shaped by fire or by peace. As the last survivors of Dresden's firestorm pass into history, the responsibility for carrying their stories forward falls to us. We who were not there, who did not feel the searing heat, who did not breathe the smoke, who did not search the rubble for loved ones, must become the custodians of their memory. That memory is more than a record of destruction. It is a guide, a warning, and perhaps even a hope. It is a warning against the arrogance of power. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany was justified by the argument of necessity, that destroying cities would hasten the end of the war and save lives. But Dresden shows how easily that argument can be stretched, how quickly it can become a license for excess. The same logic has been used time and again to justify nuclear weapons, to excuse civilian casualties, to defend collective punishment. It is a dangerous logic because it contains no natural limit. Once we accept that any atrocity is permissible if it serves a greater goal, there is nothing we will not do. Dresden reminds us that even the most powerful nations must restrain themselves, not because their enemies deserve mercy, but because their own humanity demands it. It is also a warning against forgetting. History has a tendency to repeat itself when its lessons are ignored. The conditions that produced Dresden, total war, ideological fanaticism, dehumanization of the enemy, are not relics of the past. They are patterns that can reappear in different forms at any time. In a world once again grappling with rising authoritarianism, technological escalation, and deepening geopolitical rivalries, the story of Dresden is as relevant as ever. It urges us to be vigilant, to recognize the early signs of disaster, and to act before the flames begin to rise. But above all, Dresden's memory is a hope rooted in what came after. Out of the ruins came reconciliation. Out of hatred came understanding. Out of annihilation came renewal. This is the paradox of Dresden. The city that once embodied the worst of human nature now embodies some of its best. It is a place where former enemies embrace as friends, where the language of blame has given way to the language of healing. It is living proof that history's darkest chapters do not have to define our future, that even after unimaginable destruction, humanity can choose a different path. That choice is not inevitable. It requires effort, deliberate, sustained effort. It requires education that goes beyond names and dates, that explores the ethical complexities of war and peace. It requires memorials that do more than mourn. They must teach. It requires leaders who see beyond short-term gains and act with long-term humanity in mind. And it requires individuals, ordinary people, who refuse to surrender to hatred, who reject vengeance, who insist on the dignity and worth of every human life. The city of Dresden continues to embody that effort. Today, it is a hub of science, culture, and innovation. Its universities attract students from across the world. Its orchestras and theaters draw audiences from every continent. Its streets, once filled with rubble, now host festivals celebrating diversity and dialogue. The city's leaders actively engage in global peace initiatives, using their own history as a starting point for conversations about conflict resolution, reconciliation, and post-war reconstruction. Dresden is not just a rebuilt city. It is a living classroom, a place where the lessons of the past are applied to the challenges of the present. Perhaps this is the truest form of victory, not the kind won on battlefields or measured in surrendered enemies, but the kind that emerges from self-reflection, transformation, and the refusal to repeat past mistakes. Dresden shows that victory does not have to mean domination. It can mean understanding. It can mean compassion. It can mean learning from tragedy to build a more just and peaceful world. And yet, we must never sanitize what happened. The horror must remain. The photographs of burned bodies, the testimonies of survivors, the ruins that once scarred the cityscape. They must all remain part of the story. Because if we remember only the reconciliation and forget the fire, we risk losing the very lessons that reconciliation was built upon. Dresden's greatness today is meaningful precisely because of what it endured yesterday. Its beauty is deeper because it was born from ashes. As we look back on that night in February 1945, we should resist the temptation to judge the past with the certainty of hindsight. The people who ordered the bombing were not monsters. They were human beings facing impossible choices. The people who suffered were not saints. They were human beings caught in the machinery of history. Dresden is not a story of villains and heroes. It is a story of humans, flawed, frightened, capable of great cruelty and great courage alike. And that is why it matters so much. It is not just their story, it is ours. The question that has haunted Dresden for 80 years, victory or vengeance, is, in the end, a question about us. It asks who we are when we are at war. It asks what we are willing to do in the name of peace. It asks whether we can hold on to our humanity when everything around us conspires to tear it away. These are not questions confined to the past. They are questions that confront us today and will confront us tomorrow. The skies over Dresden are quiet now. The firestorm is gone. The ruins have been rebuilt. But the echoes remain, in the bells of the Frauenkirche, in the names carved into memorial stones, in the stories passed down from generation to generation. They are echoes that call to us, urging us to remember, to reflect, to act. When we stand in the rebuilt city, beneath the soaring dome that once lay in ruins, we are reminded of a simple, profound truth. Humanity is capable of unimaginable destruction and of extraordinary redemption. We are the species that burned Dresden to the ground. We are also the species that rebuilt it, stone by stone, with hands that once dropped bombs, now extended in friendship. That is the legacy of Dresden. It is not a story that ends in fire, nor one that ends in blame. It is a story that continues, in every choice we make, in every life we save, in every act of compassion that pushes back against cruelty. The question of victory or vengeance will always haunt us. But Dresden's greatest gift is the possibility that, one day, we might no longer need to ask it. For when we learn from the ashes, when we remember their lessons, heed their warnings, and build upon their hope, we move closer to a world where cities no longer burn, where wars no longer demand such terrible choices, and where humanity's greatest battles are not fought with bombs and fire, but with understanding and peace. And in that world, perhaps, the ghosts of Dresden will finally rest.